A very good evening to you. You're watching BIS First in Focus. This evening we are going to talk about another interesting topic in the social arena. We are going to talk about social protection, especially when it comes to the aging labor force in our country. We are going to talk to none other than Professor Siri Hettige from the University of Colombo. Thank you, sir, for being here with us this evening.
Thank you.
We are going to talk about an interesting topic. Sir, when we say aging population, everyone wants to retire and enjoy their life after retirement. But according to what we've discussed right now just before the show, the situation does not seem that fair. The situation is not that beautiful. Why is it so in our country?
Well, you know, the main issue is that when you don't have, let's say, support from a reliable source, like say for instance your family, or when you don't have support from, let's say, a state institution, you are vulnerable. So most elderly people have a tendency to continue to work because they really cannot retire due to lack of an income. So I think this is really a major issue. As you know, in many developed welfare states, they have ensured universal pensions. So as a result, you know, people want to retire when the retirement age comes, and then they want to basically live a leisurely life.
Yes.
But in Sri Lanka, as you know, we have a tendency to really employ elderly people because on the one hand we have a labor issue, on the other hand the elderly people themselves have no way of surviving unless they continue to work.
True.
So that is that's really a major issue, and we see when you look at the data coming from various institutions, especially labor force participation survey conducted by the Census and Statistics Department, we see a very high rate of labor force participation among the elderly people. Even people who are above 70 years of age continue to engage in productive activities that give them an income. And of course there are exceptions, like for instance, if you have your own assets, once you are retired you can rely on your assets. If you have children who can really support you, that is also a possible way of surviving. And on the other hand, if you really don't have family support and if you don't have assets, then you have to really have your own income, and that is when you tend to continue to work, and that is what we see around in the country.
Social protection is a factor that should be provided by the government. We have ETF, we have EPF, but when it comes to social protection, when we compare our country to the countries in the region and developed countries and developing countries, where are we standing? Are we providing enough social protection to our elderly?
Well, this is a problem in the developing world in general, but of course there are variations. Now in the case of Sri Lanka, we have not been able to provide social protection to a majority of the population. For instance, when you look at various social security systems that we have, like pensions, as you mentioned, EPF and so on, they constitute about 27%, which means nearly 75% of the population is not covered by any form of social security. And these people actually have to either rely on informal sources, like for instance the family and friends and others around them, or they have to really rely on institutions. Now that is where the state comes in. But the point is that in this country, we know our social welfare budget is not very big.
Right.
I mean, for instance, if you look at the budget allocation for social welfare ministry, it is less than 1% of the GDP. It's about 80 billion rupees, as against, for instance, if you take defense, our defense budget is 290 billion. So there is a huge deficit in terms of social welfare provision in the country, and naturally the elderly people tend to be one of the most vulnerable segments of the population. And this is also evident from data. Like for instance, if you go to the website of the the police and look at the data on suicides, you will see this very clearly. Suicide rate is very high among the elderly, particularly elderly men, and of course the next very significant group is youth, where you also have a very high rate of suicide, and that is partly because both these groups tend to be very vulnerable, especially in the case of young people. They are looking for opportunities, and then when they find it difficult to find opportunities, they get frustrated, and naturally they tend to really commit suicide. The elderly people, of course, they don't really have much of a choice. They are already old, and therefore they have to be taken care of by someone, unless they have assets. And of course, as you know, when you look at the distribution of assets in this country, wealth distribution, there are huge inequalities. So you have very high concentration of assets in a very small group of people, and the rest, of course, have to live hand-to-mouth existence.
Professor Hettige, with that we have to go in for a short commercial break. We are at an interesting juncture in our interview. We will come back with more. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the show. You are watching Biz First in Focus. We are going to talk to Professor Siri Hettige more on the situation surrounding the elderly population in the country. Professor, I have here with me a graph that shows the activity status of elders in Sri Lanka that has been compiled with data from the demographic and socio-economic survey carried out in our country. Now, if you can explain to me, sir, as to what we are seeing here. We have the population by the age group, domestic work, in labor force, unable to work or retired, classified from 60 to 64, 65 to 69, 70 plus. Males and females. What are we seeing here, sir?
Well, it's basically the labor force participation data we have to look at. Theoretically, when people retire, they are no longer in the labor force. So therefore, you will have a very few people remaining in the labor force after retirement age. But in Sri Lanka, as you know, retirement age is 60. But in some institutions you have 65. But certainly after 65, you would expect a very few people engaged in any kind of productive economic activities. But what we see here is that even after 70 years of age, you have a very significant proportion, about 38% of the elderly men continuing to work, which means that they cannot really retire even if they wish to, because they don't have a source of income. I mean, unless, as I already mentioned, they are supported by their families, and of course the families should have the means to support them, and in some cases the family members don't have the means, and therefore they expect these men and women to engage in some economic activity so that they earn their own income. But of course this is not practical in many cases, because after a certain age you have health problems, and you don't have the energy that is required for you to perform many duties, and therefore you are really vulnerable, and that is when people tend to commit suicide. As I've already mentioned, you have a very high rate of suicide. In fact, when I looked at a news item yesterday in the Daily Mirror, I was really disturbed, because there I saw this elderly man killing his own sister, who was 80 years of age, and killing himself, and it's mainly because of the poverty, and that's what the news report was all about. But the point is that we have institutions in this country generating a lot of very useful information, and this is just one piece of information. But you have data being generated by a whole range of state institutions almost monthly basis. So you have really to look at this data. If you are a policymaker, if you are in parliament, for instance, you should be looking at this data, and you should be taking decisions on the basis of evidence that we generate within our own public institutions. But unfortunately, I don't see much of this information being used even in parliamentary debates.
Right.
Certainly we in the universities use this data to write papers, write policy papers, write various reports and so on and so forth. But the point is that people who are in decision making processes, decision making positions, whether you are in a public institution or whether you are in a political position, I think it is important that you look at this data. And if you look at this data and if you really take decisions on the basis of information, you will be probably making a much better decision. I mean, for instance, I looked at the budget allocations for various sectors, and there again we see serious issues. For instance, how much do we allocate for social welfare in this country? And it's a very, very small proportion. I mean, we talk big about giving money to the poor, poverty alleviation and so on and so forth, but when you really look at the larger picture, what you really allocate for social welfare in this country is very, very small. I mean, compared to other areas where we spend a lot of money. I mean, for instance, we spend a lot of money on building construction, even in the state sector, not just in the private sector.
Yes.
So the point is that you have to decide, what is important for you. Is it to address human problems, or it is to really address various other more material kind of issues.
Professor, now when we take a look at the situation when it comes from the government's point of view, we know that there are various schemes that are introduced for the protection of elderly people, to protect the retired individuals of our country, the retired workforce, various programs that have introduced by various ministries. Do you think they are also not adequate, or what is happening in that department?
Well, I think they are grossly inadequate. If they are adequate, then you will see few problems cropping up in the news and in various other fora. For instance, when you look at let's say homelessness, when you look at people who are going around begging in our urban areas and so on and so forth, you can see a lot of these people are elderly people. So if the elderly people have been taken care of, they would not be coming out and begging for money and material. So the point is that we really have not been able to target all the vulnerable segments of society through various state interventions. So what I'm saying is that we have to really allocate public resources to address the problems faced by the vulnerable. Of course, we know that we have to take care of a whole range of vulnerable groups. We have children, we have people with disabilities, we have people who have all kinds of ailments and so on and so forth. But then we also have people who really do not have a reasonable way of surviving. So I think this is one group that we need to really take care of. But I think we haven't really invested sort of very much in social protection programs in the country. And of course, it is not only big national level programs. We also have to look at what happens at the grassroots level. For instance, a lot of these people have to be reached out to by people whom we have employed to do the purpose, to do that particular job. But I see also a huge gap at that level. For instance, thousands of people whom we have employed to deal with the problems faced by the vulnerable are not really attending to their various functions, mainly because we don't have a way of mobilizing these people at the grassroots level. I mean, we have employed them and we have given them various positions and so on and so forth, but there is no accountability on the part of a lot of these people. What do they do on a day-to-day basis? For instance, how many elderly people have been really reached out to by some of these frontline workers belonging to some of these institutions. So I think we need to really address it at both a structural level, where we have to look at the institutions and the budgets and so on and so forth. We also have to look at what happens at the grassroots. How do the state institutions reach out to the vulnerable and take care of their problems.
With that, we have to go in for another short commercial break. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. We are in discussion with Professor Siri Hettige of the University of Colombo regarding the aging population and the social security aspect when providing security for these aging labor force of our country. Professor, before we went into the break, we spoke about the taxations, the privileges that are provided by the government. You echoed that it is not adequate, and if it was, we wouldn't see these problems cropping up. Now I want to ask you this question. We know that there are a lot of our elderly engaging in the agricultural aspects, things like that are in the informal sector when it comes to employment. Now the government cannot be responsible for them, can they? How can the government be responsible for them?
Well, the point is that they are not really people engaged in regular employment. They are in the informal sector, but then they are also citizens of this country, and they also work hard during their working age. For instance, lot of these farmers and informal sector workers continue beyond the retirement age. Certainly they are not retiring at 60, which means that their contribution has been quite substantial to the economy, produce food and attend to various other responsibilities. So the point is that ultimately it is the responsibility of the state to take care of the people who are really vulnerable. In this case, we are talking about even more group of even more vulnerable people, because they have no formal social security, because they have not been in regular employment. That doesn't mean that they are not really entitled for certain social benefits, because they are citizens and they have paid their dues. For instance, in this country, when you look at the structure of our taxation, it is mostly through informal what you call indirect taxes that we are. So the point is that everybody is paying taxes in this country. You cannot say that it's only regular employees who pay. So the point is that these people have been paying taxes, and I think whatever the funds that we collect through various taxes should be made use of to provide support to people, including those who have been employed in the informal sector.
At the outset discussed about the demand and supply, why these private sectors are also employing the aging population after retirement age. We see that happening in Sri Lanka more commonly than we see it in other countries. Now, isn't this because of this demand and supply? Yes, the aging population needs money, so they go and demand, and because the companies that are the private companies have supply, they employ these aging population. Now, just because if the government intervenes and says we will provide these concessions to the elderly population, will this demand and supply cycle stop, or do you think it will take another different trend?
Well, I think the point is whether you want to work or not should be your choice. It should not be decided by anybody else, and it should not be dependent on these very difficult circumstances that a lot of these people find themselves in. So the point is, if people would like to be active till they drop dead, well, that's their choice. But on the other hand, if you are forced to work due to your life circumstances, I think that is something that we cannot really accept, because these people also have a right to live in a decent way even after retirement, or for that matter when they really cannot work any longer. But I think ultimately it boils down to what we do in terms of taking care of the vulnerable groups in society in general. And I think we cannot really do that unless we have the resources to do that. Now in this country we have a real problem of redistribution. I think there is reluctance on the part of many people not to pay taxes, and I think that's partly because they ask the question, what happens when we pay taxes, and if the tax money is being wasted,
why should we pay
is
it?
being irresponsibly used, and if the money is allocated in a very haphazard way, and why should we pay taxes? But on the other hand, when you don't pay taxes, naturally the government comes under pressure, and the government would cut the cake in the way that they do anyway, and as a result it is the vulnerable people who are going to miss out. Now that's exactly what you see when you look at the budget. I mean, I looked at the budget of 2018, and I see this distribution. I mean, on the one hand we have a huge number of ministries with each ministry getting a pittance, not really getting anything worthwhile to talk about, and whereas few ministries getting over 100 billion, some even over 200 billion. So the point is that we have to look at also how we allocate public funds in a rational manner. So I think we on the one hand we have to ask people who are in a position to pay taxes to pay their taxes, because without those taxes it would be impossible for the vulnerable groups to really get anything significant by way of state and other support. I don't think that we can rely on, let's say, individual contributions like charities and so on and so forth. I mean, people go on begging every day, and every day they continue in the same way, and tomorrow you have to start again, and so on. So the point is that there are no respite. And the other thing is, you look at the homeless people, and we say that we are a middle income country, and I don't see any reason why we should have a lot of homeless people around. I mean, the first group that should be targeted by any housing authority would be the people who are on the streets, not necessarily people who are in makeshift houses. I mean, of course those people should be also targeted, but you have to start where it really matters. Now, say for instance, the destitute elderly people who are forced to work should be our first target.
Priority.
Destitute people who are forced to work, I think that is a very, very inhuman thing in any society, because you are destitute and therefore you are forced to work, and then of course you see these things happen, like for instance what was reported in the Daily Mirror yesterday. I mean, this is really the most inhuman thing that you can think of, brother killing the sister, because both are destitute, and that is really something that we should all be ashamed of in this country, where we have decent living for many people, and I think they really have to be disturbed when they see a thing like this being reported in the newspapers.
Thank you, Professor Hettige, for joining us this evening and talking to us about this important aspect that we sometimes do not pay our attention to. Especially we can do a bit, as Professor mentioned, at least pay our taxes, and maybe our aging population, the labor force in our country, will get something from the government more than what they are getting right now. So that's all we have for you from Biz First in Focus this evening. Thank you very much for watching. I've been Chaturang Haporachi. Take care.